أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وآل سيدنا محمد. Very well, to proceed, this will be the first session of our class, symposium, discussion group devoted to Julius Evola and his works. Before we begin, I think I should, given the nature of the subject and the figure in question, make a very basic disclaimer. In this course, for my part, I am interested in simply taking Evola seriously and reading him and trying to understand his position on any number of subjects. And now that in no way should be construed as me endorsing every single thing that Evola has to say. Of course, that should go without saying, but given the nature of our peculiar historical moment, I'm of the view that that such a disclaimer, if you will, is necessary. Having said that, let us move on. Julius Evola, I think, is one of the most fascinating figures in the firmament, as it were, of traditionalism with a capital T. He is second only to one figure, and that is, of course, René Guénon. And there are a number of other traditionalist writers, but these two figures are giants that tower above the rest. Of course, the other figure is that of Frithjof Schuon, who I think is a rather problematic individual, which is not to say that his writings are completely without value. I do not hold such a position, but I think that in as much as we are speaking about tradition with a capital T, and that tradition with a capital T also entails a notion of initiation and a spiritual path and a balance between the exoteric and the esoteric, given the allegations which were leveled at Schuon. He can only be characterized as a deviant due to his alleged acts of moral turpitude, which would qualify him, if indeed they are true, as having been something of a libidinous voluptuary. There are other figures. There's Titus Burckhardt, there's Said Hussein Nasr, there's Martin Lings, Lord Northburn, Marco Pallas, Leo Shīʿah, and then a later generation, not necessarily later generation, but more recent, I would suppose, Charles Upton would be an important name. James Cutzinger is an important name. And in the very younger sort of generation, there's various academics who teach usually Islamic studies or religious studies in America. People like Janir Daghla, Muhammad Rustam, who I think lives in Canada, Maria Dikaki, etc. But we are, of course, concerned with Evola, and Evola, I think, has probably been the most misunderstood of the traditionalists. If not the most the figure who was subject to most distortion, maybe by certain persons or in certain quarters. And of course, I have in mind what is usually termed the right, or even the alt-right, whether in the United States or in Europe. In the US, the alt-right is now very much associated with Donald Trump and Trumpism, and a kind of ideologue or supporter of Trump, namely Steve Bannon, who famously apparently quoted Evola in one of his, I think, online writings, or maybe somewhere where he was speaking. So, the figure of Evola has been appropriated by various groups, often associated with the right or so-called right-wing movements. And I think that Evola probably would have shunned such an association, or that his ideas, his writings are being utilized by people of this tendency. So how do we approach a figure like Evola? How do we understand him? Well, I think if we really want to understand Evola, we also have to understand René Guénon. And it wasn't just that Evola was an admirer of Guénon, and that he, in fact, translated Guénon into Italian. Both figures enjoyed an extended correspondence, an extended correspondence over many years. I'm not at all certain when their correspondence began, but it was a very prolonged one, and extends all the way until Guénon's death. And in this small pamphlet length work, there are some excerpts from the letters exchanged between Evola and Guénon. So I'm just trying to see if he mentions when it began. He says, personally, this is on page 26 of René Guénon, A Teacher for Modern Times. He says, personally, I have had a cordial relationship with Guénon and pursued a correspondence which lasted to the end of his life. So, yeah, I'm not sure when it started, but obviously it went on for quite some time. So Evola is not just an admirer of René Guénon. He is, I could say, even be seen as a kind of, if not collaborator, certainly a kindred spirit. Could you turn on the light? It's getting a bit dark here. Thank you. And Evola has written a brief kind of introduction to Guénon, in which he was trying to introduce him to the Italian reading public. And this was done in more than one context, or in the context of maybe more than one article or preface. And so in this pamphlet, you have more than one essay. There's the first one is called, is just, bears the heading here, Man under the pretext of conquering the earth has lost touch with metaphysical reality. That's supposed to be a kind of epigraph for this essay introducing Guénon, because underneath it says, this is the conclusion reached by René Guénon after much study. Then that essay, extends from page 11 of this pamphlet until page 20, where he commences another sort of brief essay entitled East and West, A Gift of Languages. This is followed by, on page 23, René Guénon and the Guénonian Scholasticism, and that's where that's, I think, the last essay here, which only goes up to page 26. And then we have my correspondence with Guénon, and then the pamphlet concludes on page 31. So I'm not going to discuss everything in this pamphlet, but I'm going to focus on certain important passages. So if you want to understand Evola, of course, you must realize that he gives his allegiance not to any particular religion or any particular philosophical school or any one peculiar metaphysical doctrine. Rather, his allegiance, if we may call it that, his perhaps loyalty would be a good term, is to tradition with a capital T. And by tradition with a capital T, in both Evola and Guénon, they have in mind the underlying metaphysical truth and doctrine, which by its very character is an eternal verity, and therefore does not change from time to time and place to place, from one human community or one human collectivity, or from one civilization or one peculiar religious form to another religious form. These are eternal verities. Metaphysical truths are eternal verities, and therefore tradition is, with a capital T, universal with a capital U. And it is in this context that Evola produced very substantial treatments, studies, if you like, of particular religious traditions, namely the doctrine of awakening, which is, in my view, the best work on Buddhism ever written in a Western language. I think this opinion is shared. Isn't this opinion shared by Krishnanand Venkatesh? So Krishnanand Venkatesh is someone whom I've met. He happens to be a tutor at St. John's College in the Santa Fe campus, and is himself a Buddhist. He teaches liberal arts there, and he has also expressed this opinion. But it's not just, I just mentioned that because I happen to know this fellow. But there have been other figures who have made that made the same characterization. The names of these of one of them in particular escapes me at the moment. But if you actually consult the introduction to the Doctrine of Awakening, there is the name of that person is found there. It was I think it was one of the people who actually translated that book into one, I don't know, remember which language, and then he himself became a Buddhist and so on and so forth. And at any rate, and then there's the Yoga of Power, which is a study of a particular kind of Indic tradition, namely the tradition of Tantra. But again, these books are not written from the point of view of a scholarly kind of erudition, but again, they're written from the point of view of adherence to, again, these transcendent universal metaphysical principles that are part of that constitute tradition with a capital T. So Evola, if he has any kind of label, it would be of a traditionalist. And in fact, I would say radical traditionalist. Radical in the original meaning of the word radical, meaning to be rooted. I mean, at root, he is a traditionalist. And he is quite uncompromising because one cannot compromise on the truth. And this comes out in his throughout all of his writings. Now, what really distinguishes Evola from Guénon is the fact that he lived well into modern times. Evola was born 1898. He died in 1974. He served in the First World War. He did not serve in the Second World War, but his allegiance was very much to his country and to what became known as the Axis powers. So Italy under Mussolini, Germany under Adolf Hitler. He also speaks favorably of Japan. So Japan under Emperor Hirohito. So that's where his allegiance was. And that's one reason, he's considered to be supposedly controversial. But again, it is utterly simplistic to try and reduce Evola to these categories. So to say that Evola was a mere fascist or a mere Nazi, which is often said about him, is extremely simplistic, especially given the fact that he wrote against fascism, that he has his own understanding of what possibilities fascism represented for him as a historical and political phenomenon that he, mind you, didn't study from books, but lived through. And the same goes for National Socialism. And he has a book called, what is it? Notes on the Third Reich? Yeah. So I cannot emphasize strongly enough how one must resist and indeed denounce the tendency to reduce Evola to these simple categories, these simplistic designations. Turning now to the actual essay of Evola, I think there's some important passages here which I would like to focus on. So the first essay that begins on page 11, man under the pretext of conquering the earth has lost touch with metaphysical reality. This is the conclusion reached by René Guénon after much study. René Guénon passed away at the age of 65 in Cairo, Egypt, where he led his life far away from the European environment, writes Julius Evola. Evola continues. He was a teacher of our times, the defender of integral traditionalism, and the most outspoken of anti-modernist thinkers. Despite the fact that several works of Guénon's have been translated and published in Italy, and here he tells us in a parenthetical remark, I have translated into Italian what is perhaps Guénon's most comprehensive work, namely La crise du monde moderne, meaning the crisis of the modern world, end of parenthetical comment. He has not enjoyed the same popularity and consensus of authors such as, and then he names some people, Kayserling, Ortega y Gasset, Spengler, and Massis and Jung. I really don't know who Kayserling and Massis are, but this is not fundamental to our discussion. He goes on to say, it is my opinion that these authors, as far as spiritual stature and sobriety of doctrine are concerned, certainly cannot stand at Guénon's side. So Guénon is really quite uncompromising. And that is what Evola identifies as the contributing factor to his lack of so-called success, which he puts in quotation marks. In other words, his not being so widely known as these other figures whom he mentions. And in fact, Guénon really didn't care. So if you've seen any of my videos on René Guénon, I've talked about how Guénon was not really interested in cultivating some kind of a popular readership or promoting himself, his ego as an author, or gaining a following, or even selling books. He was writing for a very small number of people. He saw it as his function in the Kali Yuga, this final age of historical cyclical time. And he saw his function as communicating these truths and maybe reviving, or at least bringing them into a modern European language. Right. So Guénon is quite uncompromising, as I was saying, and Evola writes further, Guénon does not have and doesn't wish to have any association with modern culture and mentality. He represents a different worldview. He does not speak his own mind, nor does he defend his personal viewpoints, but instead he upholds a body of principles, perspectives, and values which are objective and universal. Again, this idea of tradition being eternal verity, since they are the legacy of civilizations which flourished prior to the individualistic and rationalistic decline of Western civilization. The modern world is characterized by what Evola and what Guénon as well would agree as being the complete and total negation and repudiation of the sacred order. A repudiation and even a denunciation, an active rebellion, I would say, against the ancient doctrine of a transcendent and metaphysical order, of absolute truths, of eternal verities. Evola writes further on page 12, he's trying to give us the key to Guénon's teaching. And it's important for us to understand that because Evola shares this. Now so you might, naturally the question arises, is Evola completely in accord with Guénon? And the answer is no. But for the most part, he is. There's one extremely important place where he is not. There's one particular point where which is quite far-reaching, I think, where he doesn't concur with Guénon, and we will come to that near the end of our discussion of this pamphlet. So he's giving us the key to Guénon, and he says, and I quote, "The cornerstone of his entire system is the notion of a transcendent reality which towers above the world of reason and of the senses, higher than mysticism, sentimentalism, or philosophical speculation. So Genon distinguishes, unlike many modern people, between mysticism and true spirituality. For Genon, mysticism is distinguished from a true intellective or intellection or intellectual spirituality by the presence of an emotional and sentimental element. In other words, it's not really at the level of noesis, at the level of intellection, or the use of the nous is the term in Greek, which is translated into English as intellect or intelligence. But intelligence, when we use that to translate the Greek term nous, it doesn't mean a merely kind of prowess, as it were, in the exercise of the rational faculty that you might find among someone who's very good at solving math problems in their head, or of quickly assimilating material, or being good in debate. It means the experience of higher noetic realities, things which are above and beyond the senses, and really correspond to the domain of what, at least in ancient Western philosophy, is known as the Platonic forms or the Platonic ideas, and which in the Islamic world are known as al-a'yan al-thabita, or the fixed entities, in the terminology of someone like Muhyiddin ibn al-Arabi, just to give one example from the Islamic tradition, but we don't want to go too much there. That would get us off topic. So Genom is quite uncompromising in his rejection of modern deviation, of the civilization which is based on the rejection of what let us now call the metaphysical order. What does Genom mean by metaphysical and by metaphysical reality? This is the question posed by Evola on page 15, rhetorically, which he will now answer. He continues, "This is a fundamental issue which many will fail to understand, since it refers to spiritual horizons which are virtually unknown in our times." So they're only virtually unknown, right? They're not completely unknown. They cannot be completely unknown. There always has to be at least one person, at least a group of people, even though it may be small, that will have access, that will be able to understand metaphysical reality. So he says that it is virtually unknown in our times, and which are unlikely to be reduced to any category employed in our modern civilization. When Genon talks about metaphysics, he specifies that by this term he does not at all mean a philosophy, and not even a particular branch of the discipline which calls itself philosophy. Full stop. Let's pause here for a moment. What is being referred to here is that field or subfield in classical philosophy known as metaphysics, which is the study of existence, or existence as such, or being qua being. That is to say that in metaphysics, one doesn't study this or that existing object as the object moves, for example, in physics, or as the object as a manifestation of discrete quantity, as we find in arithmetic, or continuous quantity, as we find in geometry. But it studies things in as much as they exist. And what does it mean to say that an object exists? What does it mean to say that one object is different from another? That is the area of philosophy known as metaphysics. So Genon doesn't even have that in mind, even though that's a beautiful subject. But Genon, when he uses the term metaphysics or metaphysical, does not mean that branch of philosophy. Evola continues, the term metaphysics in Genon's works finds its meaning in reference to an essentially super-rational plane, something above mere rationality. So in metaphysics, as it's found in classical philosophy, as it's found in Aristotle, as it's developed, for example, in Aquinas, as it's developed by someone like Aquinas, or as it's developed by someone like Avicenna, Ibn Sina in the Muslim world, or other figures, is very much an activity or an inquiry, I would say, that involves the exercise of ratiocination, that involves the exercise of merely the reason. In other words, it works on the plane of irrationality. Claims are made for which proofs are offered. Arguments are made. So Guénon is saying that no, metaphysics is not this, but it refers to an essentially super rational plane. So something that is above mere reason. And so for Guénon, the intellect or the intelligence, the nous, is something which is above mere reason, above mere conceptual elaborations and arguments, beyond what is conditioned by time and space. And so, subject to change and soaked in particularism and in the sensible world, there exists a world, in contrast to what is in time and space, there exists a world of intellectual essences. These essences do not exist as mere hypotheses or abstractions of the human mind, but as the most real of all possible realities. Man could realize this world. In other words, he would have a direct experience of it, as certain as that mediated to him by the physical senses. So according to Guénon, it's possible to experience this realm of essences, what I will call a noetic realm, again from the word nous, and one can have a vision, as it were, of that which is akin to, but in fact more powerful than even the sensoria, than even the data of sense perception. So we broke up the sentence. Let's go back to the beginning of the sentence. He says, these essences do not exist as mere hypotheses or abstractions of the human mind, but as the most real of all possible realities. Man could realize this world. In other words, he could have a direct experience of it, as certain as that mediated to him by the physical senses, only if he succeeded in elevating himself to a super-rational state, which Guénon calls pure intellectuality. In other words, this state could be achieved only if man proved himself capable of a transcendent use of his intellect, an intellect freed from any specifically human, psychological, affective, individualistic, and even mystical elements. Guénon employs the term metaphysics in relationship to a transcendent realm associated with an inner asceticism, which aims at going beyond the world as it is conceived by religions. So for Guénon, true metaphysics, integral metaphysics, is something which lies even beyond the, shall we say, relativizing formalisms of any particular religion, because it is universal. So he isn't negating those religions, but he's saying that metaphysics is something that sort of is above those. So I think that's a really, really important passage. So Evolov also sort of talks about some of the various works which Guénon wrote. This was before the passage I read you a few pages before. And then he refers to some of the other works of Guénon, sometimes in more detail, sometimes more in passing. Guénon also repudiated certain tendencies in his time. There was an explosion of what we could call spiritualism in his time, an interest in contacting the spirit world and the souls of departed loved ones, especially after the First World War. People conducted seances. There was even something called the Theosophical Society, which was a very strange syncretistic mix of Eastern ideas and Western confusions, Eastern doctrines and Western confusions. And Guénon wrote against these things. And again, Evola shares Guénon's contempt for those, in contrast to what were actual traditional sciences in ancient civilizations, So many contemporary readers who approach Genon, not only do they find all of this very challenging, but the fact that Genon rejects much of the theory behind modern science. He certainly didn't deny the existence of the steam engine or something like this, or trains or airplanes or what have you, but the kind of underlying worldview of modern science. And again, he was very much an advocate of traditional sciences, but then many contemporary readers are shocked by this, in the sense that traditional sciences include astrology, they include various kinds of divination, they include things which are now by moderns regarded as superstitions and just so much nonsense. Genon, of course, also talks about how we are at the end of a cycle. Now, it's very important to understand that Evola and Genon both believed the traditional capital T understanding of time as a cyclical thing, and as not being purely quantitative but being qualitative, and that there are these 4 cycles, which in the Indic terminology are called the yugas. And the first is the there's different terms in Sanskrit, but you find the idea in Greek, ancient Greek as well, in someone like, let's say, Hesiod and others. But the Greeks spoke of a golden age, a silver age. They talk about these metals: the golden age, the silver age, the bronze age, and the iron age. In the Sanskrit terms are somewhat different, but you find in both of them that either they speak of iron age or they speak of the more often of the Kali Yuga, which is the term used in the Indic tradition. So we are in the Kali Yuga, and we're really, Genon thought that we're very close to the end, and that because we are in the last cycle, and when this cycle reaches its endpoint, it'll not be possible to go any lower. So on page 19, Evola says, thus, Genon ascertains that since a cycle is ending, and since it is impossible to go any lower, one can only expect a final crisis followed by a timid recovery and by a reconstructive phase. However, Genon is not certain where and how this is to take place. The fundamental task consists in creating some elites, he italicizes elites, in which the sense of metaphysical reality must be rekindled, and which will formulate new principles necessary to establish a new order. But where is the starting point, asks Evola. In one of the previous traditions, again, question mark. As far as the West is concerned, the task could befall Catholicism. So here there's a few remarks are made about Catholicism. It seems that in the beginning, Genon thought that Catholicism could be a kind of bulwark of traditionalism with a capital T against the degenerative tendencies of the Kali Yuga. I don't think he held that view all the way to the end of his life. And Evola certainly did not. Evola was, Italian. He was raised in a Catholic family, but he did not uphold Christianity or Catholicism or Christianity for that matter. So it's not really clear what is supposed to happen at the end of the cycle. Genon also makes it clear he's not sure how this cycle of the Kali Yuga, the Iron Age, will end, and then the new and the next Golden Age will begin. He doesn't really know, and he's not sure if there's a complete discontinuity or if there are some remnants that will survive at the end of this Yuga and go into the next Yuga. And also it's important to understand that this cyclical view of history is not a circle. I want to say that again. This cyclical notion of the 4 ages or yugas is not circular. It is cyclical, but it is not circular, meaning that when you get to the end, you don't come back to the beginning. You come to a new beginning. So you're not going around a circle. It's 3-dimensional. You're going up a spiral. And the spiral goes on indefinitely. So it's not that history will repeat itself. I want to make sure that is clear. Now, this is one area where Evola is quite different than Genon. So Genon has been characterized as having been someone who was very much just a pure spiritual. To use a more ancient terminology, he is a pure pneumatic. Pneumatic, meaning pneuma, the pneumatic. Where's the chat thing? I can. This is a new version of Zoom. Well, it's PNEUMATIC, if I'm not mistaken. So it comes from a Greek meaning spirit, so he's a, let's put it in more contemporary English. He's a pure contemplative, and Evola is more a man of direct action. Action not as frenetic activity, but genuine action. And because he lived much longer than Guénon, and he wasn't averse to commenting in writing on the political currents and tendencies of his day, and Guénon very much was, Evola had his own sort of understanding of a kind of resistance, if you like, that could be mounted by people who still remain standing, is a phrase you find in Evola, the men who still remain standing, the men who are there among the ruins. And he has another book called Men Among the Ruins, Post-War Reflections of a Radical Traditionalist. So oddly enough, and this will come up in the next essay of his, which we're going to look at, which is Orientations, 11 points. But in brief, Evola, although he recognized that there were serious problems with National Socialism as well as fascism, he liked the idea that in the case of fascism in Italy, that there was some movement, there was some sort of an idea of going, of kind of taking on this notion of ancient Rome, because Evola is very much opposed to the idea of the modern nation state. He favors, well, imperialism in the literal sense of the term, of empire, of the Latin would be imperium, or the imperium is how we would say it in modern Anglo American English, imperium. And to the extent that he saw the forces which were unleashed after the French Revolution, Jacobinism and democracy, republicanism, and collectivism, ultimately going toward communism, Bolshevism. He saw all of this as coming out of that, and he saw that the forces which were rather, still he would agree, not perfectly and imperfectly, that were coalescing against this development. In other words, fascism in Italy, National Socialism in Germany, and Japanese nationalism, Japanese imperialism. He calls it the samurai, a kind of samurai ideal. So Evola is very much someone who is a warrior, a kshatriya in the Sanskrit terminology. And so in his orientations, he tries to set down certain guidelines for a kind of resistance to this tendency. But again, we can't just reduce him to fascist tendency, a fascist, a textbook so-called fascist, or a adherent of National Socialism. There were elements of National Socialism which he didn't like. Socialism as such he doesn't like. Also, the more sort of bourgeois elements that were also present there. Hitler is not exactly an aristocrat, although there were sort of people of aristocratic tendency or pretensions, if you like, involved in National Socialism as well. So it's not really clear, to return to our topic, what exactly is supposed to come after the Kali Yuga, other than it's supposed to be replaced. And how that will happen is not clear. There's only this sort of idea, albeit vague, and a vague idea of a kind of excuse me, elite that has to be constituted, that upholds tradition with a capital T. And this is very important. It is this elite whom Guénon is addressing in his writings. Whoever they are, whoever comes upon these writings, presumably they will be read by this elite. or those who are a would-be elite, those who will become the elite after reading Genon's books. So Evola is also part of this sort of tendency. I think he also had in mind a particular audience in his writings, but he is also much more concerned with actively constituting an elite, or actually offering what Genon never does, which is actually offering some sort of practical guidelines or suggestions for people to make sense of their lives in the Kali Yuga, and to actually live a meaningful life that doesn't involve a complete and total capitulation to the degenerative processes which are becoming more and more severe and pronounced with every passing day. So that's one important difference. The second important difference, so that one important difference, which I just pointing out, is that Evola is considered, trying to give practical solutions. He, in that sense, the element of the warrior and the kshatriya, the active dimension, is much stronger. So he's not a pure contemplative. Now, it may be asked, and this brings us to the second major difference between Evola and Genon: are those two mutually exclusive? Is contemplation are contemplation and action mutually exclusive? I don't think they are, and my reading, at least, of Evola also is that that they are not. And this is a major point which he has against, and in which he differs strongly with René Guénon. And there's a particular passage I wanted to introduce here to illustrate this point. And I seem to have lost. Right. Well, this is on page 24 and 25. This is under the heading of another little essay in this booklet under the heading René Guénon and Guénonian scholasticism. So Evola is against any kind of a dogmatic reading or an elevation of the teachings of Guénon to the level of dogma, and it is his contention that this took place to some extent in a traditionalist journal called Études Traditionnelles, or the Review of Traditional Studies, and they reviewed one of his books, which was The Doctrine of Awakening, and he took issue with that review, and it's in that context that he raises certain points. So Evola points out that Guénon really didn't understand Buddhism, and you have to know that Guénon favored the formulation of the Indian school known as Vedanta as a kind of universal language for metaphysics. Now, Evola doesn't take issue with that, but because of Guénon's allegiance to that, initially he rejected, and not only rejected, but denounced Buddhism as a deviation. And it was only later, when he was challenged on this by by a scholar of Buddhism, I think he actually was Buddhist for a time. I don't know, it's complicated, but that's A.K. Kumaraswamy. A.K. Kumaraswamy challenged him on this. Guénon conceded that he was wrong about Buddhism. So here on page 25, Evola says Guénon's initial evaluation of Buddhism was plagued by, and I quote, an astonishing lack of understanding. This evaluation, continues Evola, was suppressed in the English edition of Orient et Occident, in other words, East and West, which was published Paris 1924. Guénon later modified it in part by making some concessions to a Brahmanic, in other words, Hindu version of Buddhism, which is truly a Buddhism eviscerated of the specific and valid elements it possessed at its inception. These specific elements concerned an autonomous way of realization. So Evola very much liked Buddhism, but not Buddhism as, you know, we find, let's say, Tibetan Buddhism or something. He when he's talking about Buddhism, he means according to him, the original doctrine of the Buddha. Now, what does that mean? For Evola made a very serious study, and apparently these sources were very well translated into Italian. I really don't know. I have maybe there are people who are aware of this, but I don't know that Evola actually had a knowledge of Pali or Sanskrit, but he knows the terms. If you read the Doctrine of Awakening, and he obviously had very good access to the Pali canon, on which he bases his book. So he considers the Doctrine of Awakening, the original teaching of the Buddha, to be an eminently Aryan, and by Aryan he means a notion of noble, and the way doctrine, a doctrine of a kind of spiritually noble race. So Evola doesn't really have a doctrine of biological racism, but he does have the notion of a kind of a spiritual race, a kind of spiritual predilection or affinity, and that's what he understands by the term Aryan. Arya originally simply just means noble, and it actually does not refer to a particular biological stock. Now, whether it was used for that afterwards is another matter, but the original sort of linguistic, literal meaning of the term is noble. And so he thinks that Buddhism is this Aryan doctrine, that Buddha was an Arya, and moreover, that the Buddha was a Kshatriya. He was part of the warrior class. So the kind of ideal spiritual type for Guénon is the pure contemplative, and the ideal spiritual type for Evola is the warrior sage. Now, Evola doesn't see these as mutually exclusive. So people like Guénon and also people like Kumaraswamy speak of the sacerdotium and the regnum, the class of the purely religious, the purely spiritual, a kind of priestly class, if you like, and a royal class, or a priestly caste and a royal caste. But for Evola, he says that these were never really completely mutually exclusive. They were often united in one person who was the philosopher king, or in the ideal of sacred kingship in ancient times. Let me see. There was another passage. No, I stand corrected. That was the passage I had in mind. So for Evola, he actually thought of Buddhism as he interpreted as being a kind of ideal spiritual path for people living in the Kali Yuga today. And that's really why he wrote the Doctrine of the Awakening. He has another book called Ride the Tiger, which is far more abstract, which is also supposed to be a guide for, as the subtitle indicates, aristocrats of the soul. Again, this idea of a kind of race of the soul. We're living in the Kali Yuga. But I really think that Doctrine of Awakening and Ride the Tiger have to be read together. And it seems to me that that's more than likely the kind of spirituality which Evola himself practiced. You have to understand that in the Second World War, he was gravely injured and from thereafter was paralyzed from the waist down. So he couldn't really go anywhere. So exactly what kind of a spiritual path he pursued in the confines of that very small and circumscribed space of his apartment and his chair, his wheelchair, I imagine. Which is in some ways, it's really kind of sad if you know more about the life of Evola, because he was an avid mountain climber in his youth and well into his up until his injury. Excuse me. And in fact, he has a very nice collection of essays called Meditations on the Peaks, which we'll also look at. Now there is a strange book that claims, which I don't have, but I got a PDF of it, that Evola received some sort of Sufi initiation from Guénon, and that he was actually a crypto Muslim or something like this. And I just find that so hard to swallow. And I've read passages from that PDF copy that are alleged to be conversations between this individual who knew, claims anyhow to have known Evola, and it just doesn't sound like him. So I really don't know what to make of those claims. And I unlike Guénon, who became a Muslim and went completely even and practiced as an all the exoteric doctrines, it doesn't seem to me that Evola was that type of person. Especially, with his paralysis. I think he was very much just given over to a certain kind of, paradoxically, his action and his activity would have been an inner one, as opposed to, I don't know, practicing some sort of a physical, some disciplines of physical culture like mountain climbing, which he was really into, because it's very clear, if he has another essay on Zen Buddhism and the samurai, it's very clear that he espouses, and it also comes out in Meditations on the Peaks, an ideal of kind of physical culture. And the fact that in let's say something like martial arts, there's really no room for kind of nonsense, which you do find among intellectuals, modern intellectuals and academics. They can just sit and spew out all sorts of nonsense, but that won't work if you're in a fight to the death, and it doesn't work even if you practice martial arts, as a so-called sport. Either you have done the movement correctly or you've not, and there are levels of correctness and expertise and so on and so forth. So paradoxically, he kind of ends up living his life as a contemplative, because he is prevented from a kind of vigorous kind of physical, spiritual training due to his injury. Right. So I think that's all I have to say about the relation between Evola and Guénon, and I want to discuss his essay Orientations, and then we'll probably wrap it up. But before we go on with his essay called Orientations, 11 Points, is there anything we should discuss? I've talked a lot. So if anyone wants to chime in at this point, we can do so. No? All right. Moving then to Orientations. I'm using the version, the wording is the same, but it was also published in a handbook for right-wing youth. This is the version that's published in A Traditionalist Confronts Fascism. So again, to reduce him to being a fascist, it's A Traditionalist Confronts Fascism. Evola has a kind of, for want of a better term, a kind of, shall we say, profession of faith. Maybe that's not a good way of putting it. Manifesto, again, maybe it's not a good way, but it basically, Orientations is the title. And it just says 11 points. So there are 11 points which he wants to make, and he uses as a title Orientations. And that's, I think, an interesting word. Obviously, orientation means you're facing towards something. You are situating yourself in space, figuratively speaking. You are assuming a particular, shall we say, position or stance. And it is this position or stance or positions or stances, or if you like, contentions, which Evola would like to set out, and they are 11 in number. And this was written in 1950, and they very much concern the peculiar historical moment of post-war Italy. And that's the historical context. But what he says here, I think, goes beyond that particular historical moment. And much of what he says applies now to 2022. So, point 1. This extends over pages 1 to 27 of A Traditionalist Confronts Fascism. Point 1. There is no point in indulging in wishful thinking with the illusions of any kind of optimism. Today, we find ourselves at the end of a cycle. He's talking about the Kali Yuga. So he's being very, very stern. There's no optimism. Things look really bad. This is not a good situation. What are we going to do? That's what he's trying to say in orientations. He continues. Already for centuries, at first insensibly, then with the momentum of a landslide, multiple processes have destroyed every normal and legitimate human order in the West. It's actually everywhere, it's not just the West. And falsified every higher conception of living, acting, knowing, and fighting. And the momentum of this fall, its velocity, its giddiness, has been called, quote unquote, progress. And we have raised hymns to progress and deluded ourselves that this civilization, a civilization of matter and machines, was civilization par excellence, the one for which the entire history of the world was preordained until the final consequences of this entire process has been such as to cause some people, at least, to wake up. So he's addressing those people who have just woken up from their slumber. To use another image, those people who remain standing, those who are men among the ruins of post-war Europe. Now he gets immediately to the point. So he's saying to those people who are awake, it is well known where and under what symbols the forces for a possible resistance tried to organize. He's referring to the Axis powers. On one side, a nation that since it had been unified had known nothing but the mediocre climate of liberalism, democracy, and constitutional monarchy, referring to Italy, dared to assume the symbol of Rome as the basis for a new political conception and a new ideal of virility and dignity. Analogous forces awoke in the nation that in the Middle Ages had made the Roman symbol of imperium its own in order to reaffirm the principle of authority and the primacy of those values that are rooted in the blood, race, and the deepest powers of a stock. And while in other European nations, groups were already orienting themselves, orientations, orienting themselves in the same direction, a third force in Asia joined the ranks, the nation of the samurai, in which the adoption of the outer forms of modern civilization had not prejudiced its fidelity to a warrior tradition centered upon the symbol of the solar empire of divine right, the Emperor of Japan. So he goes on, he makes it clear that, this wasn't perfect, but nevertheless, it represented at least some kind of a resistance to the forces which had been unleashed by the French Revolution, the so-called Fourth Estate. In other words, the coming to power of the hoi polloi and the tendencies and sensibilities of the hoi polloi, the average, the proletarian, as well as the bourgeois. I think really it was these. We really don't get to the sort of impending dictatorship of the Fourth Estate until now, and we're seeing this everywhere. For example, what happened in Sri Lanka, what's happening in Iraq, what's happening in Pakistan, and what may well happen here in the United States, especially when the next election rolls around. But this is a kind of tendency where, in other words, the mass man is bursting forth. Up until now, it was really the kind of dictatorship of the and still is to some extent of the not the proletariat, but of the merchant, of the technocrat, of the business person, the Gateses and the Jobs, Bill Gates and the Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk type people of the world. So Ebola is very much against this horrible sort of unleashing of these destructive forces, and he really sees Western civilization moving toward complete and total sort of collectivism, or what was represented at least by the Soviet Union. And paradoxically, I don't know if people will agree with me, but I think that's really the tendency. That's where the United States is going. It's moving in that direction. At any rate, that's my opinion. That we can discuss and debate that. So at the end of point 1, Evola says, the only thing that counts is this. Today, we find ourselves in the midst of a world in ruins. Mind you, he's writing in 1950. He goes on, the problem to pose is, do men on their feet still exist in the midst of these ruins? Question mark. And what must they do? What can they still do? Question mark. So I think this is very eloquent, and he really sets things up very nicely in a very accessible language, very concise. There are some sentences here which are even have a kind of aphoristic elegance to them, even in translation. So in point 2, he again alludes to the Second World War, and of course the devastation, which I'm sure could still very much was very much visible in 1950, and was very much in the living memory of people alive at the time. But he says that the devastation of the Second World War, he says they have to recognize that it's really a desecration, a devastation of a primarily moral character, he says. We are in a climate, this is on page 3, of general moral amnesia and of profound disorientation, despite all the accepted ways of speaking in common use in a society of consumers and democracy. The surrender of character and every true dignity, and ideological wasting away, the supremacy of the lowest interests, and living day by day in general characterize post-war men. Recognizing this, he says, means also recognizing that the first problem, the foundation of every other one, is of an internal character. Getting up, he says. Getting up on your feet, standing up inside, giving oneself a form, and creating in oneself an order and uprightness. So he says that's the first task. The first task is the, shall we say, inner project. Maybe that's through the practice of certain inner disciplines that as he sets out in the doctrine of awakening. But that's what has to come first. And it's only then that you can have so-called political activity. And he says this quite explicitly here in the next sentence. People who delude themselves today about the possibility of a purely political struggle and about the power of one or another formula or system, who do not possess a new human quality as a precise opposing vision, have learned none of the lessons of the recent past. Here is a principle that ought to be absolutely clear today more than ever. If a state were to possess a political or social system that in theory would count as the most perfect one, but the human substance of which it is comprised were tainted, well then, that state would sooner or later descend to the level of the lowest societies. And then he contrasts this with the situation where the state is completely corrupt. A political system is completely faulty and imperfect. But if there are people there who are awake, who are pursuing the inner project, they will survive. The measure of what can still be saved, rather, depends on the existence or absence of men who stand before us not to recite talking points, but to be models, not yielding to the demagogy or materialism of the masses, but to revive different forms of sensibilities and interests. Now, as we go on, we'll see he elaborates on these ideas point by point, up to 11 points. But I wonder, he was such a profoundly intelligent man. Did he not understand that this is really kind of futile? Maybe he did, but he thought that, okay, maybe there's one or two people who will read it. Obviously, we're here discussing Evola, right? There are other people who are discussing Evola. So there's that idea in Evola that even though the task seems hopeless, even though we can't stop the Kali Yuga, and so in a sense, defeat is inevitable, you fight on in the trenches. You don't concede. You don't give up. That is what is dictated by honor, by dignity, by courage, by the ideal of the kshatriya, the warrior sage. That it is simply the task to be done, and it must be done and accomplished impersonally. And one will die in the trying. But the idea is that somehow the torch will be passed on to whomsoever is ready to receive it. So this idea of fighting on, even in hopeless positions. He speaks also in point 3, for example, of the notion that loyalty is stronger than fire. And he completely denounces the political realm and existing political order everywhere. He says, for example, just a few choice quotes which I've collected. He says, this is point 3. So in alluding to what happened in the Second World War, he says this was the commitment of the forces which dreamed of a new order for Europe, but which was often frustrated and misled in realizing it by manifold factors. Today, that commitment must be taken up again. And today, the conditions are basically better because the situation has become clearer. We only need to look around from the public squares all the way to Parliament to see that our vocations are being tested and that we have clearly in front of us the measure of what we should not be. This is a complete denunciation. Before a world of mush, he says, whose principles are you have no choice or else, quote unquote. And then also, quote unquote, we'll have time for morals after we take care of our stomach and our skin. There is also, quote unquote, these are not times in which we can permit ourselves the luxury of having character, unquote. Or last and least, quote unquote, I have a family. When we hear these slogans, we know how to give a clear and firm response. As for us, we cannot act in any other way. This is our life. This is our essence. Whatever positive achievements are accomplished today or tomorrow, he continues, it will not be by means of the skills of agitators and political operatives, but by the natural prestige and recognition of men both of yesterday and even more of the new generation who are capable of so much and thus vouch for their idea. So despite everything, he's hopeful. You know, he's setting down these ideas. Hopefully someone will read them and they will embody them. So it's clear that Evola's notion of action is not one of a kind of frenetic activity or of a kind of, shall we say, meaning, a kind of very conventional political organization along the lines of parties, which he rejects political parties, or the kind of canvassing and political activism, which is all too well known in our times. Evola will have none of that. He is very much first and foremost concerned with this kind of inner project and having a kind of all uncompromising commitment to ideals. So he is both anti-proletarian and anti-bourgeois. He says that the thing that he's arguing for, this kind of project that he's arguing for, is the creation of a kind of a human substance, or the cultivation of a certain form of human substance, the creation of a particular kind of a human being, or actually he never says human being, he says a man. And he says that this formulation, in other words, of this new substance, this formulation defines a direction that calls itself as much anti-bourgeois as anti-proletarian, a direction. Again, orientation involves direction. A direction completely liberated from democratic contaminations and social whims, because it leads to a world that is clear, virile, articulated, and made of men and men's guides. It has contempt for the bourgeois myth of security and the petty life that is standardized, conformist, domesticated, and moralized. Contempt for the anodyne fetter that is part and parcel of every collectivist and mechanical system and all the ideologies that attribute to confine social values the primacy over those heroic and spiritual values which the true man, the absolute person, ought to be defined for us in every area. So he is very much committed to the doctrine, to the idea of the hero, this kind of heroic individual who, against all odds, will resist until the end, remain standing among the ruins, until he himself perishes. So I just have a couple of other things maybe to point out, and then I will conclude. So Evola sees liberalism as being quite dangerous. He says liberalism, then democracy, then socialism, then radicalism, and finally communism and Bolshevism only appeared historically as steps taken by the same evil, as stages in which each one prepares the next in the complex unity of a process of decline. So these are manifestations of the degenerative processes of the Kali Yuga. Now, Genon usually doesn't talk so openly about these, and this is another really distinguishing feature of Evola, is that he's willing to sort of enter the fray and commit himself and actually comment on political ideologies and the historical events that were behind them. The beginning of this process is the point at which Western man shattered the fetters of tradition, rejected every superior symbol of authority and sovereignty, claimed a vain and illusory liberty for himself as an individual, and became an atom instead of a conscious part in the organic and hierarchic unity of a whole. This is a really important sentence, and it's very much reflected in René Guénon's The Reign of Quantity and the Signs of the Times in chapter 6 and 7. He goes on, in the end, the atom was bound to find that the mass of the other atoms, the other individuals, had turned against him, and he was dragged into the plight of the kingdom of quantity, of pure number, of masses that are given over completely to materialism and who have no other god than the sovereign economy. So he says that this already starts with the French Revolution. He says, in this process, there is no stopping halfway down the road. Without the French Revolution and liberalism, there would not have been constitutionalism and democracy. Without democracy, there would not have been socialism and demagogic nationalism. Without the preparation of socialism, there would not have been radicalism and finally communism. Now, he also thinks that democracy and communism go together. He says at the bottom of page 8, where I am on point 5, the great illusion of our days is that democracy and liberalism are the antithesis of communism and have the power to stem the tide of the forces of the low, what is called a progressive movement in the jargon of the labor unions. This illusion is like saying that dusk is the antithesis of night and an illness's incipient stage is the antithesis of its acute and endemic stage, or that a diluted poison is the antithesis of the same poison in its pure and concentrated state. He also very much hates America and the United States. So there's an interesting quote here. Again, he's writing in 1950. He says, from the point of view of the idea that inspires them, Russia and North America can be considered as two tongs of the same pincers, which are tightening inexorably around Europe. Think of NATO, and think of now of NATO versus, Russia and China, and in terms of what's happening in Ukraine. It's very timely, and it's interesting that the Russian philosopher Alexander Dugin has very similar things to say, but that's another topic. Just mention that in passing. In them, in other words, in North America and Russia, in them we see the same foreign and hostile force acting in different but converging forms. The forms of standardization, conformism, democratic leveling, frantic overproduction, the more or less arrogant and explicit cult of the expert, and the petty materialism of Americanism can only clear the road for the final phase, which is represented in the same direction by the communist ideal of the mass man. The distinctive trait of Americanism is that the attack on quality and personality is not accomplished by means of the brutal coercion of a Marxist dictatorship and the care of the state, but takes place almost spontaneously by means of a civilization that does not recognize ideals higher than wealth, consumption, profit, and unchecked economic growth. An exaggeration and reductio ad absurdum of what Europe herself has chosen. This is what the same motives have created there, or are in the process of creating. On both sides, we see the same primitivism, mechanical reductionism, and brutality. In a certain sense, Americanism is for us more dangerous than communism because it is essentially a kind of Trojan horse. He goes on and further down the page, he says, again, there is no stopping halfway down the slope. Americanism, willy-nilly, is working for its ostensible enemy, collectivism. Very interesting remark. Finally, he's very much against people who think that the main problems that confront human beings today are somehow economic. So he speaks of what he calls the hallucination or demonic possession by the economy. And he considers this view to be a very characteristic and unprecedented aberration, as he calls it, of modern Western man. In other words, this obsession with the economy is not normal. And then he makes the very important point that capitalism and Marxism are both trapped in this closed and dark circle, as he calls it, of the demonic possession by the economy. He says, we need to break this circle wide open. As long as we talk about nothing else but economic classes, work, wages, and production, and as long as we delude ourselves that real human progress and the genuine elevation of the individual is conditioned by a particular system of distribution of wealth and goods, and therefore has to do with poverty and ease, with the state of prosperity, a la the United States, or with that of utopian socialism, we yet remain on the same level as that which we need to combat. We need to assert the following, that everything that relates to the economy and the view of economic interest as a mere satisfaction of physical needs has had, has now, and always will have a subordinate role in a normal humanity. So he's arguing for an order of superior values above and beyond economics, above and beyond material things, above and beyond this kind of proletariization, as he calls it on page 15 of everything. So that is really, I don't have much more to say. I think that this is a very accessible text by Evola, and I think it's an excellent entry point, his essay Orientations, into the vision of Evola, and also his Meditations on the Peaks, which I think we'll have to deal with discuss next time, is also extremely accessible. His other writings are a bit more involved, but anyhow, this is what I wanted to present. And so I will conclude and just stop here and open it up for a freewheeling discussion and debate, Q&A. Yes, proceed.
Oh, all right. I guess, there's a lot of things we covered there, and it's kind of split nicely into two sections. The first, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, there was a lot covered there. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I was just going to say it's split kind of neatly into two sections of when he's discussing Gunon, it's about his, like you said, the metaphysical ideas and their stance in general, and then the orientations is for the kind of positive prescriptions he does want for society. So if there's anything you would like, both of you would like to focus on first, we can go ahead with that. I would be interested to hear.
No, I'm done. You go ahead.
Okay. Well, for the first part, if we're just going in order, I guess. I enjoyed I guess that there's a very nice presentation of his viewpoint, and I think it is important what you said about how Guinan and Evola use metaphysics, because most people will assume the
Yeah,
branch of philosophy. So that's an important distinction to make. I
that's a
like
very
that.
important. Yeah, yeah,
And in terms of this eternal truth thing, what you call kind of these universal, capital U verities or truths.
yeah.
I like that point a lot, and I think if there are any other, I'm sure everyone who's interested in this in Evola and Guinan will have some familiarity with studies of comparing different religions and things like that. So I
Yeah.
would like to kind of make the distinction that uh, it's not an effort to kind of collapse and mix stuff up, like you said. It's just an effort to distinguish uh, different paths at arriving at certain things, and
Mm.
for it's all done in comparison to the modern world. So just to say that this is what they had, these traditions had, that we do not have right now. Not to say that what they had is all the same either.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think that you put it very well, and it's things which it's what the modern world has either lost or has ignored, which I guess amounts to the same thing. You know, if you ignore it long enough, it's gone. And so there's been a kind of disappearance or eclipse of those ideas, and again, they can't completely disappear, but they're very hard to find. And I would also say that they those truths are universal, and again, that doesn't mean that there's a complete fit, a one-to-one correspondence. Like if you take your right hand and your left hand and put them just exactly on top of each other, I don't think it's a complete congruency like that. I think it's more kind of rotated. Like if you put your one hand right on top of the other and rotate the one so that the fingers of each are in the gaps of the other hand, it's something more like that. And you also find that in translation, and translation is not a merely sort of mechanical exercise. If you want to translate, and I have done this, I mean, I translate a lot from much of my work these days is translating classical Arabic texts into English, for example, and some of them are of a metaphysical nature. And there's terminology in Arabic and there's terminology in the Quran which doesn't exactly come into English, because a lot of the so-called religious terminology, for example, in English is heavily imbued by Christian doctrine. And you'll find that when you translate almost anything into English, especially any kind of deep spiritual text. Like, let's take the example of Buddhism. I mean, Buddhism has sort of entered American popular culture. You might even find many people have a basic working knowledge of Buddhism if they're sort of inter-comparative religion, and they'll say, well, the first noble truth is that everything is suffering. Is that really what the word means? Does that word actually mean suffering? Evol also focuses on this. It really, in the original Sanskrit, conveys something more like agitation rather than suffering. So you have to be careful. So even though there is a kind of, the metaphysical reality is the same, but metaphysical truth has to be expressed in a language. And so there isn't a one-to-one correspondence. Like the word Allah in Arabic, the word which we regard as the name of the divine essence, the personal official name of God, so to speak. How do you translate that into, let's say, classical Chinese? I was thinking about this the other day. And I have a translation of the Quran into Chinese. I don't really read this, I'm a complete beginner. But now things are easier because you can get these online. And so I was looking at the characters and then I was putting them into Google Translate and to seeing how they have the word Allah, and the actual translation had a character, which I'm not sure how it's pronounced in Mandarin, but if you give it, how it's also used in Japanese. So Japanese, I'm much better at. So the word was shin, and shin in Japanese, which is the Chinese reading as pronounced by Japanese people of that classical Chinese character, it just means true or real. And then the next character it means Lord. So it means the true Lord, or the true, the ultimately real. But then on the other hand, some people would say that, well, Allah conceived of as the absolute is actually the Tao. But if you actually look in Taoist texts, the Tao Te Ching, the Tao originally in classical Chinese means literally a way, and in modern Chinese it means a road. At least according to my dictionaries behind me. So it's very complicated. But then on the other hand, it says in the Tao Te Ching that the Tao that can be spoken of is not the eternal Tao. And the way that can be named is not the true or eternal way. Or name, excuse me. Dao ka Dao Fei Ching Dao Ming ka Ming Fei Ching Ming. And if you look at translations of the Tao Te Ching, there's so many different ways of interpreting this. And the classical Chinese is like that. I don't think you have that same level of ambiguity in modern, Mandarin Chinese. But that's just one example. And you find the same thing in Sanskrit and so forth. So these things are equivalent, but you have to be very careful in the translation. I don't know if you agree with me, Nico, but that's sort of my take on what you said.
Oh yeah, I definitely agree. And that you mentioned all of the interesting translation the translation kind of not necessarily errors, but the very easy ways that translators can conflate terms, or because their language is built around when the language is developed, they don't have a concept of that term when they invent, when they kind of created it. So I know like the Chinese and Japanese term that you mean, that can range from an absolute deity to like a pagan little idol, that
Absolutely.
exactly.
Yeah.
So and it's interesting what you said about Doctrine of Awakening a bit earlier. I've read some of it, like I'm halfway through it, and I would definitely agree that for any beginner, it's a very clear-headed way to get into Buddhism that avoids kind of pop culture dilution, I suppose you could say. I personally, as a Buddhist, maybe there's a thing I would quibble about, but it's a very matter of fact presentation, I think, that gets all the sources and everything right. All the sources are the original, the oldest that are available, Pali Canon, and he does cite quite a lot. And as for I remember you made a point about hold on, let me remember now.
Yeah, take your time.
What was it? Oh yes, it was his idea of it as kind of a noble path or something like that.
Right, the Arya.
Yes, the Arya. So that term, at that point it does mean noble, and I think that kind of idea is quite unique because it's conceiving it as sorry, I'm trying to formulate this. I think you can understand his dispute with Guénon from this perspective. If Guénon is the more intellectual side, it is logical that he in his studies he focused on the Hindu and the Brahmin tradition, whereas Evola's temperament is for the Kshatriya. And from that perspective, the Buddha was a Kshatriya who was dissatisfied with simple intellectual things and wanted more of a direct experience.
Yes. Your mic went off.
Oh yeah, sorry, there was some noise outside.
Your mic went off. Yeah.
Yes, there was some noise outside.
But sorry.
Yes, that's mostly what I want to say. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I would agree with you. And in your characterization of Evola, and I have a couple of observations on that as well. But before I present them for everyone's consideration, I would ask you the question, if you don't mind. You said you maybe potentially quibble on some aspects of the Doctrine of Awakening as far as you've read. You said you're a few hundred pages into the book, so I'm curious to know what those quibbles are, if you don't mind.
Yes, I don't mind at all.
I think it's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is an interesting kind of point that I noticed. So I appreciate definitely the commitment to originality in Evola's study, because kind of originality and purity of doctrine kind of go together. So I think early on he says, this is kind of this is relevant to the popular understanding of Buddhism, I suppose. So early on, he says that the belief in reincarnation is kind of a foreign influence, and he presents it as kind of a chthonic influence that must have come in from the less Arya followers, I suppose.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. I was listening to someone who was confused about why he would make this claim that is kind of distinct from his other sourced claims. And I think I have a rather best guess that is
okay.
That I think makes sense. So I will concede that reincarnation, does have a lot of this chthonic associations of like, and when I mean chthonic, I mean kind of earth fertility religion, kind of a bit more primitive. I base kind of my understanding on the historian of religion Eliade, who noted that a lot of primitive religions went through this phase when they went into farming. They venerate mother goddesses. Harvest is kind of linked to reincarnation. All these things.
True.
And the people that grew up in the society are the ones that the Arya kind of rule over. So Evola is kind of characterizing it as it's a influence from below, so it's not, it can be interpreted, it's not too important to the doctrine. I would say that, and it's a later influence.
Yeah.
I would say that it's not really later to the degree that Hinduism already had a conception of it before. So it's kind of like, Buddhism adopting that, and also that originality in terms of his which came first in history is not the sole. Not necessarily should be like one of the main determiners of how true or how valuable you hold something. For example, he does appreciate the Buddhism in Japan, which of course came later and came by way through East Asian influence or something like that. Yes. So that's just a thing that any Buddhist reader might like meet that and say, we'll say something similar, but that's not important to his his presentation of the facts. Basically is not affected by that statement he makes.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think let's just go with this, because this is an important point. So neither Evola excuse me, nor Genon accept the doctrine of reincarnation. Now, from what you've said, it seems that you do.
I would say that Buddhism does, and it considers it as a necessary part. It is, yeah.
Okay, so this is very interesting, because I always found this to be a major problem. Not for me personally. Let me rephrase. I found this to be a major problem in the context of the doctrine of the transcendent unity of religions, which is upheld by traditionalists like Genon, like Shuan, for example. Yet both Genon and Shuan himself, he's just following Genon in this, and Evola as well, they reject reincarnation. And I found that problematic, because every book I had ever seen on Buddhism, reincarnation is a pretty important part of the whole doctrine of samsara, isn't it?
Yeah.
And yet these guys, on the one hand, the traditionalists, when I say these guys, I mean these three great figures of the traditionalist world. So it seems that they pick and choose, and they reject reincarnation for some on the basis of a certain metaphysical argument, and they say that this is a later accretion, but they don't do the same with the Trinity in Christianity.
Interesting.
Which I found very strange. So I wasn't too interested in the Trinity. I just don't think you can argue that. There's just been so much research done on that, even since when I started, in the works of people like Bart Ehrman, who's a New Testament scholar. So let's leave that to the side. But when I first encountered these writings, I didn't have a good knowledge of of Indic religions, and I was very interested in this. And I tried to find resources, and I read a lot of, I read whatever I could find, which ended up being a lot in terms of quantity. I don't know how good the quality was, but I read a very interesting article in this regard in the Encyclopedia of Religion, which was edited by Mircea Eliade. And that article is about the term karma. And the article in that encyclopedia was written by Robert Thurman.
Yes, I
Robert,
know him.
You know him. So Robert Thurman, I don't know if he still teaches at Columbia. He runs Tibet House. He used to be a translator for the Dalai Lama. Every now and then, I think he probably still translates for him. His daughter is a very famous Hollywood actress named Uma Thurman, who was in the Kill Bill, fantastic movies, by the way. But the Kill Bill series, very, very, very interesting. I mean, of course, none of it is accurate. You don't actually do swordplay that way. But anyhow, so, and I later went on to meet the guy once. That's another story. Wow. During the Kala Chakra of 2006, but that's a whole other story. So if you read that article on karman in Sanskrit, karma, he makes it very clear that the term karma originally referred to ritual action.
Yes,
okay,
I agree.
Ritual action in a Vedic context. And so there were all sorts of rituals that the ancient Vedic, priests would perform, and there was a whole bunch of different priests. There was a sacred fire, and one of them would chant, one of them would be doing something else. And there were various sacrifices, and mind you, there was animal sacrifice. So this idea that these guys are all a bunch of nice vegetarians, which the way they try to talk about it in India now, is just not true, and that they don't take any life. And there was a famous kind of very important sacrifice known as the Ashvamed, which is the horse sacrifice, in which the king is involved. Anyhow, so this refers to ritual action, and all of this stuff is being done by these Vedic priests, and the king is also officiating, and there's all sorts of ceremonial. So this all refers to ritual act, and that if you do not do the ritual action correctly, it leads to negative karma. And the whole ritual acts that are involves a kind of rebirth, but it's a figurative rebirth, an initiatic rebirth, if you like, a ritual rebirth. And that if some kind of terrible mistake is made in the ritual, then the ritual goes bad and you don't get a favorable rebirth. And I thought that was very interesting. So this is where the idea is coming from, because Genon and Evola, they all say that this is a later day corruption. It has nothing to do with the original doctrine. But again, they don't offer a lot of evidence. So I just sort of filed that away in my mind. And then when I later met, well, I'm going to have to go into a little bit of personal. So I was very curious about Buddhism, and I have taken great effort to study it, not just from books, but by actually going and observing and meeting people. I've traveled throughout Japan. So to make a long story short, I attended a Tibetan Buddhist initiation in 2006 in South India, known as the Kal Chakra Tantra Abhishek. The Kala Chakra Tantra Abhishek means initiation. And it was extremely interesting. And Robert Thurman was there. A lot of other people were there. And, to the credit of the Tibetan Buddhists, they don't mind if you're a non-Tibetan Buddhist, you can come and observe. It's quite open, A lot of them thought that I had just converted to Tibetan Buddhism or something, but I made it clear, no, I was here just doing a kind of participant observer study, for want of a better term. And they were quite open. I talked to them, and it was very clear that, Thurman believes in reincarnation. And so people like Genon and Evola, they say that this reincarnation is not a literal thing. It's figurative. They give it all sort of, different. And apparently Kumaraswamy believed this too, which I think is really interesting, because out of all of these, Kumaraswamy actually knew the texts. So if you read his book called Hinduism and Buddhism, very difficult read. None of his books are easy. This becomes clear. So it was clear to me that, Thurman believed this. But in another context, I was in Japan, because I was fascinated by, Evola's writings on Tantra. And that there is Tantric Hinduism and there's Tantric Buddhism as well, right? And Tibetan Buddhism is so-called Tantric Buddhism.
Yes.
And there's a lot of misunderstanding about this term of Tantra, and there's no sense in going into that, but it simply means that you achieve liberation in body, mind, and speech. And so body means that there's some sort of rituals that are done, especially in Tibetan Buddhism. There's ritual gesture. there's prostrations, there's mandala offerings along with visualization in the mind, and then there's speech. They have mantras, of which the most famous is Om Mani Padme Hum, which they pronounce differently in Tibetan. So I was very interested in researching this whole concept of this tantric Buddhism, and I found out, that there is actually another kind of tantric Buddhism. People think it's only Tibet. I don't know how much it survives inside, mainland China today, but the real place where it really survives is in Japan.
Yes.
And in Japan, it's called Shingon Mikkyo. And Mikkyo means sort of esoteric. They actually call it esoteric Buddhism. So to make a long story short, there's two main sects. There's Shingon is the one, then there's another one called Tendai. But anyhow, I was more interested in Shingon. So I went to the headquarters of Shingon Buddhism, which is Koyasan. I even have my coffee cup is Koyasan, Mount Koya in Japan. And I investigated it there, and I met a very extraordinary Western convert to Shingon Buddhism, and he studied with Hakeda, who was a Japanese scholar at Columbia, and then went on to become a Shingon Buddhist priest. And his name is Aijo, or Tom Drightline is his American in his Western name. And I asked him the same question, and I said, "Well, look, do you believe in reincarnation?" And he said, "No." And I said, "Does Shingon?" And he said, "Well, it's not." He says Shingon doesn't talk about. And I said, "Why?" Because the whole doctrine of Shingon is that you achieve enlightenment in this very body, in this very life. That if you do the rituals as taught by, Kobodaishi Kukai, and you meditate on the two mandalas, and you do the meditation, which is very similar to the deity meditation, as it's called among the Tibetan Buddhists. But Shingon's only got the two mandalas, and they have their mantras and so on and so forth. If you do all that, you will achieve enlightenment, so it doesn't really matter. And I said, "Okay, fine, Tom, but what about this idea that this is a later thing, and a later accretion?" And I mentioned to him the article by Thurman, and Drightline is very, very well read, and he said that's actually true. This is what he said. So I really don't know where to stand on this at this point, because anytime you meet Buddhists, they defend this.
Right.
I met when I was at Princeton, there was some sort of thing for Tibetan freedom, some sort of demonstrations going on. And so there were a bunch of Tibetans in town. And there were a bunch of them who were monks as well. And they were making a giant sand mandala in the Chancellor Green Cafe, as it was known. I don't think it's there anymore on campus. It was a student hangout. And they were making the sand mandala. So I went there. And I noticed that there was this big head monk who was in charge of these others, and he had an interpreter. An interpreter was a female, a Buddhist nun. And I struck up a conversation with her, and I realized this wasn't going to go too far in English. But most of these people live in India, so it turned out she could speak Hindi very well. So I said to her, "Well, this head monk of yours, is he a geshe?" And a geshe is like, it's a certain level of learning.
Yeah,
it's like a Ph.D. or Doctor of Divinity. So he said, "Yeah, he is." And I said, "Okay, well, I want to talk to him." And she said, "Okay." And so then I got into a debate with him. I said, "Look," so I went through the whole thing. I set it up. And I said that, if indeed Buddhism, one of the fundamental teachings of Buddhism is the doctrine of no self, anatma. And, you have dependent origination and dependent co-origination. I went through the whole business. And I said, so if all of this is true, and that if there actually is no atma, then what transmigrates?
Exactly. Yes.
And then, he didn't like faint at that point or something, like I was expecting him to. He just came back and he said, "Well, there is a kind of psychic residue." That's how she translates. She said, she spoke in Hindi, but what she meant was that something remains because of karma, and that karma constitutes the sufficient reason. That's not how she said it at the point, or the efficient cause is how I would say it, for the next incarnation. And so we just came to an impasse, and he wouldn't concede, and neither would I, and that was it. But it was instructive. And I subsequently had that same discussion, and it went more or less the same way, with someone who was much more articulate in English, namely Thupten Jimpa.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Oh, you've heard of him?
Yes, I heard of him as well.
Yeah, so I mean, Buddhists are, especially Tibetan Buddhists, are very nice people. Okay.
Yeah.
And so when I went on that Kala Chakra, I made a lot of friends in the Tibetan Buddhist community. And one of them is this guy named Phil Void, who is a musician. And he has a famous song for Tibetan freedom called Rang Zen. Anyway, so I became friends with him, and then we kept in touch, and every now and then he said, well, you want to come and attend these teachings? And so I would go. And so I attended these teachings of the Dalai Lama in Delhi like a year later. I think it was 2007. And so Phil arranged for us to stay in this above this Tibetan restaurant in New Delhi, in Connaught Place of all places. That's like Piccadilly Circus in London, or Times Square in New York. So we were staying there, and it turns out that Thubten Jimpa was in town, and he came and he hung out there for us for a while, and I had a lot of extended discussions with him. So, he's a very famous, Tibetan translator, editor of the Library of Tibetan Classics, one-time translator for the Dalai Lama, still translates for him. And, he wrote a whole PhD dissertation published, I think, at Cambridge University Press, or he defended it at Cambridge on Lama Tsongkhapa, who's the head of the Gelugpa, founder of the Gelugpa, the yellow hat tradition.
Yes.
So anyhow, so I really don't know what to conclude then about this position of Genon Evola et al. But I do find it very hard to swallow the idea that people pass through this realm of samsara once again. I don't know how you feel about that.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of info, and your firsthand accounts. That's actually extremely interesting. Actually, I wasn't sure.
Yeah.
I know Thurman, like you said, believes in it, and he thinks it is required for Buddhism to work as a system, if you can put it that way.
He thinks reincarnation and monasticism and the whole. Yeah, he does.
Yes. So, and I'm aware from a more distant standpoint, he is kind of a true believer. Very not necessarily doctrinaire, but he's very.
Oh no, he's doctrinaire.
Oh yes,
I directly. We had some very. I'll just say we had some very direct conversations.
Yeah. So I guess I'm more open to the suggestion than that. But that what, like, the first-hand account from the Shingon priest, that's very interesting, because that's definitely true. They do believe that it can be achieved in one lifetime. Now, the later corruption situation, I'm just
gonna you keep talking. I can hear you. I have to just
okay, no problem.
Close the window.
I will just say that yes, that could be a possibility, since the texts that we do have are like centuries after when they were supposedly orally said by the Buddha or by his contemporaries. So the situation could be it was a later accretion by the time the Buddha spoke. It was a later accretion to both Hinduism and Buddhism after both of them have were established, or it could be in my view that it could be that whichever one it is, it ended up kind of now most people believe it to be that way, to be reincarnation, and it is not necessarily hurtful or harmful to bringing it back to Evola. I don't necessarily believe it is hurtful or harmful to Evola's ideals.
Yeah.
If reincarnation is involved, I know the argument for why it would be against, or why he would be against it, but I think you could have Evola's same ideals and believe in reincarnation as well, to bring it all back.
Yeah. No, that's a fascinating. It's a fascinating topic, and I really don't know how to reconcile these interviews I've had and personal encounters in terms of what I've read. And having said all of that, I remain unconvinced of the doctrine of reincarnation.
Sure.
Anyway, There was something else I was going to react to what you said about Evola, but now I don't remember because we got off on this whole. There's a saying in Arabic, "Al-kalam yajuru al-kalam," that in conversation one thing leads to another. And so yeah, these things often have their own logic, and so now I forgot what you had actually said before, but anyhow.
Would you like to discuss the second?
Yes, proceed. Yes, I'm
Oh no, I was just gonna say the thing that struck me about orientations is kind of a trend that it's kind of a trend in the you can call it the discourse or something like that in online. It's mainly online, so it might be a bit niche. So there is this, like you said, the readers, most active readers of Evola these days are kind of found him through their own experience, probably. Would you say? And they're associated with the right, the online right. So in that, for better or worse, in that circle, or which is by now it's a broadening circle, there's been kind of a debate, can the modern world, the situation of the modern world, which you made clear in some of your videos, can be characterized as the reign of quantity, as Gunan put it, right? So and you talked about the mass man before, and how both democracy and communism are degenerating into that situation. The debate is that whether individualism is one of the chief factors to blame. So it used to be taken, Evola's position is that yes, it is one of the chief factors, I believe, and Gunan's as well.
Yes, I would say.
Yeah, and now there's kind of a faction in the online sphere who's saying that, well, it's not exactly individualism that can be blamed for these for the condition of modernity, I suppose. And their argument might be the case that this mass man is a kind of a primitive kind of communitarianism that that the ideology of communism is precisely anti-individualist, which might be easier to see. And then when you move to democracy, it's easier to see the individualism in terms of because democracy is more associated with consumerism contra communism. So the kind of, I guess, to be more articulate about it, historical features of the ideologies put certain things in opposition that are not necessarily in opposition. Like you said, Evola believes communism and democracy are not so different. And so the individualism associated with capitalist democratic society might not be that individualist after all. When we look at the influence of trends in mass media or something like that, how easily people are able to be influenced. Perhaps it is not over individualism that is the threat, but like communism, to bring it back to what Evola saw as their similarity, the kind of way crowds have been constructed, I suppose, to be so easily influenced.
Yes, I think that you have to keep in mind this concept, which is there in the reign of quantity. Let me see if I can point you to the direct. I'll directly point you to the chapters in question. And so to the points that you have raised, this notion of individuality. So in chapter 6 and 7, and I haven't made the lectures on this yet, but I'm hope to be filming them in the next week or so. At any rate, so chapter 6, the principle of individuation, and then 7, uniformity against unity. This is what Evola was alluding to in the contentions, sorry, not contentions, in the orientations, when he talks about the atom, the atomization of human beings. And so on the one hand, you have in America this notion of of individualism, a kind of radical particularity of each person. But the fact is that the system deals with everybody in a kind of mass way. And so that individualism is really kind of a fake individualism, I would say, in the sense that the kind of individual which is generated is not an integrated one, but one who is simply a conglomeration of the basest sort of tendencies which are glorified by the modern world. And so anything which would lead to a kind of integration of the personality and open up possibilities and indeed entire vistas for liberation is systematically suppressed. And so what you have is what I think in another video I talked about, what Jacques Ellul speaks of in his book, The Technological Society, and has another book on propaganda. And these books complement each other and they overlap quite a bit. That what we have in the modern world is the systems and structures in place create a particular kind of individual, or they, how did he put it? They foster and generate, they produce a kind of systematic vacuity of the individual, which lends him to suggestion by the system of whatever the system deems to be strategically opportune. So whether that's in the United States gun control or vaccines or bombing Libya or Iran or whoever the enemy is of the moment, Putin, right? That people will automatically go along with that. And in many ways, Ellul's books are on the one hand prophetic, but on the other hand, completely fall short, because he could never have conceived of the degree to which technology has made possible the complete propagandization of an entire society. It's almost like an alchemical processing. And indeed, and this guy is on the right, very much on the right, a guy named Michael Hoffman II. He calls it, he actually uses that term, the alchemical processing of humanity. He has a book called Twilight Language, which is a revised version of his psychological warfare, Secret Societies and Psychological Warfare. So there's other things which he's written which I completely don't agree with, but you know. So, but I do like that turn of phrase of Hoffman's, the alchemical processing of humanity. That's where we are. So so the propagandizing is so subtle because it's entered the education system. And the education system, especially in the United States, is very much dumbed down. It's not really a training. It's not in any way a kind of real training of the discipline of learning and things like this. It's really a kind of mass indoctrination. And that's what we also have in so-called social media, and as well as in so-called popular culture in the form of American films, and it's not so much even television anymore, but streaming shows, right? They all uphold a certain zeitgeist. And if they don't get made, because Hollywood, you know, promotes a certain worldview. So you know, I'm not really privy to these discussions that you alluded to in this particular online community or communities, but I think that this kind of individualism really is a symptom rather than a cause. And then once it becomes across society, then of course it engenders, it acts as a cause for other effects. But ultimately it is because of this whole deviation at root within the reign of quantity and the moving away from essence toward substance, as in the terms that Guénon uses in the reign of quantity. This is where we are. And at root, there is the spirit of rebellion, which is the sort of essence of individualism. That's where it starts as I know better. It's individualism as opposed to, you know, submission to authority and hierarchy, and that truly is the impetus on the human level, in the human domain of the Kali Yuga, and that is, you know, best represented in recent history by the French Revolution, which I think was a pivotal turning point in human history, but in the unfolding of the degenerative processes of the Kali Yuga. So that's my observation on that.
Yes, I think that's like, all, you know, precisely everything I agree with pretty much. That's the, like, atomization is the right word, as opposed to individualism, which has good and bad sides. Atomization is kind of a decontextualization. I think you used that word as well. Such that, and I think it's so kind of ubiquitous that that, you know, more, you know, well, not necessarily, it's not even hidden knowledge at this point, you know. People who are in charge of things are aware that getting rid of a base of knowledge or a common belief system is the first step to creating a new one. Like you said, French Revolution, they have to reset everything, you know. So I think that's so, and you know, like you said, technology is a chief way to do it quickly, efficiently, and all of that. So I think that's exactly what. So it's kind of a atomization, destabilizing first, and then building back up in a way that is flexible to that can be propagandized more easily. So is a nice way you summarized it.
Yeah, again, the alchemical kind of symbolism is you know, dissolve and coagulate. That's really what's happening, and it's not the first time it would have happened in history. You know, I don't know how far this would apply to our situation, but it's interesting nevertheless. And this is way back in far earlier in the, but still in the Kali Yuga, when Shi Huangdi, the Emperor Shi Huangdi, you know, wants to inaugurate his dynasty. He destroys all the books from before.
Yeah.
The Confucian books, in fact. So there is this idea of a sweeping away of tradition and of traditional knowledge to establish something new in its place. And that is why I would say that in the modern world, in America in particular, in terms of popular media, films, and so forth, anything having to do with religion is made fun of.
Yes.
Whether that's on the cartoon South Park, or whether that's in, you know, a very popular sitcom show from the 90s called Seinfeld, or other programs of that kind. Okay, here's an example. There was from recent popular culture, there was a movie called The Martian. I don't know if you're familiar with this film. It's about this guy, he gets stranded on Mars, you know, it's a science fiction movie. I forget who the actor was in that. Anyway, so he has to get back to Earth. And so throughout, and he's in a dire position, but he never prays. God is never invoked, you see? It's all just science and scientific. And then at one point, he needs to actually, I think he had to burn something, and he was looking for something to burn. And so everybody else who was on the mission has died. And he's going through some of the personal effects of one of the dead astronauts. And he finds a wooden crucifix. Okay. And he burns it. And I thought that the symbolism there was, mind you, I say this as a Muslim, and I don't believe in you know, Christian doctrine, but nevertheless, I found that element in the movie to be utterly satanic.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I guess, you know, when you were mentioning earlier a bit, you know, what people are discussing, it's pretty much this in terms of so and they have kind of converged on necessarily this opinion, this insight that the traditionalists had, which is like which is like you said. I suppose the example of Ebola is very, it's kind of in a way very accessible, in comparison, if we are comparing to Guénon, because
Yeah.
in his more active statements, or his political
Writings.
positions, yes, and political writings, and his idealism of the warrior, that
Mm.
is kind of one of the main things that society has lost in
Yeah.
contrast to the intellectual, because the soldier is not valued like the warrior was. There is no real, there is veneration for soldiers perhaps, but there is no valuing of it in the traditional sense, or that's long been swept away. There's no,
Yeah.
everything is non-violence, not to, there's also gratuitous violence, of course, which Evola is not talking about, but
Mhm.
I think the ideal of the warrior is a good example of integrated individual in a context, because they can serve the nation, they can serve a ruler, and yet they can pursue their own glory for certain things, and that's what makes them famous eventually in myths and all that, religious literature and traditions basically. Meanwhile, the soldier in the in our age, and it's extremely hard to imagine a situation where this changes
Mm.
just because of the nature of warfare. It's just an instrument,
Mm.
and
Yeah.
I that's probably why Evola valued some of the Axis powers, because they maybe took a different position, even if they had to fight in the same way.
Sure. No, I think that's a very good point. The ideal of the warrior has completely been eliminated from the modern world. Instead, you have the idea of the professional soldier or the conscript. And again, those are atomized. They just need, they need 100,000 men on the front or what have you. And it doesn't really matter. They're all trained in the same way, almost in a kind of robotic fashion. That when it comes down to, two infantries facing each other, that they make sure that people pull the trigger, or they make sure that they march into battle. And there's no sort of higher ideal there. It just comes down to almost a kind of animal instinct. And you don't really have that in traditional warrior societies. And moreover, the Western democracies at least pride themselves on diplomacy and international law and the international rules-based order, and such locutions which, excuse me, they're just such unadulterated nonsense. Because they're entirely hypocritical. Because when it comes down to it, again, it's gratuitous violence. It's violence on a mass scale. The United States in particular is the great exception, American exceptionalism. If they decide that they want to go and destroy a country or destroy it, they do it. Right? And it's all done in the name of human rights and promotion of democracy, or eliminating weapons of mass destruction, or whatever the ideological legitimation which is put forward. And so on the one hand, you have this idea of somehow they constantly glorify some sort of a pacifist ideal. And then they look down upon the strong man. Indeed, and they'll in fact refer to dictators, people they say that are dictators, leaders which the US would characterize as dictators, as the strong man, Libyan strong man, Muammar Gaddafi. Or, maybe we'll start hearing this about Xi Jinping soon, or maybe we already have, so there's always this kind of delegitimization, and these acts of mass violence then are portrayed. It's really George Orwell, isn't it? War is peace and peace is war. But when it actually comes down to the idea of a warrior ethic, and that, of course, because we're talking about war, that involves death, doesn't it? So there has to be some notion of martyrdom, and there really isn't such a thing in American military, doctrine, for want of a better term. But you do have it in the samurai ideal, right? There is the code of the warrior, Bushido. And there are various Bushido texts, and one of the sort of vulgar translations is Bushido means to die. But what the Japanese I looked into this. I asked people who know the text, know Japanese very well. It really means that, it means that the way of the warrior, the warrior must be ready to die at any moment, to give his life in the context of feudal Japan for the feudal lord, for the daimyo. And so that's why many of them cultivated, or some of them cultivated Zen Buddhism, because of the teaching of sort of in the fostering of the notion of a kind of equanimity and calm, even in the face of tremendous danger and odds and risk and personal risk of personal harm. So that has been entirely eliminated, and even anything that goes in that direction has been demonized in the modern U.S. With notions of, they call it toxic masculinity, or this kind of idea that people should, men, particularly young men, should be able to fight and have a physical culture and develop. It's all been replaced with sort of video games, and there's been a kind of emasculation and a feminitization, similar to what happened in Japan after the Second World War. I don't think it's an accident that they outlawed all martial arts in Japan, with the sole exception of Aikido, because Aikido was portrayed more as some sort of a religion, I suppose. And having trained in various Japanese martial arts and having visited Japan many times in my youth, I knew people there who absolutely hated what had happened in Japan. And they actually said this, that there was a kind of emasculation, as it were, of the Japanese male. And anyway, that's a whole other topic. But I think that there are, on a certain visceral level, a lot of people understand that this is something that's missing. And it's something which they would like, to be able, or it's a dimension of the human character, particularly the male character, to want to cultivate. And I think that that's maybe one reason that certain kind of people are attracted to what Evola wrote, because he very much does have that idea. And maybe that's, maybe why some of the people on the right also gravitate to that, in as much as they're very angry and they want to, I don't advocate that, but, interested in various acts of violence and so forth. So, Evola just, he does have a really interesting bunch of essays, which also will look at some of them. It's called The Metaphysics of War, which I think is a very interesting collection of his articles.
Yeah, and I think my kind of one of the things you said that kind of made me recall something that was said. I can't take credit for this idea. I read it, but it was a very interesting perspective. It was that in modern democratic society, bureaucracy is, rather than, it's advertised possibly as, well, it is advertised as giving responsibility to the people, but then it's also a way for leaders to avoid responsibility by claiming that this is not their responsibility, it's the people's responsibility.
Yeah.
And that, I think, reminded me of, and so then that person who said that, or who wrote that, said that in contrast, traditional societies had, monarchy, which I know Evola is a fan of, and that was one person taking direct responsibility, for better for good or bad.
Yeah. Yeah, there is a whole notion that nobody's responsible. Oh, I don't know, I'm just following orders. I can't do this. These are the rules. That's very much part of monolithic bureaucracy. There's actually an interesting a book that deals with some of these themes by another traditionalist author, whose name was Charles Legai Eaton. His Muslim name was Hassan Eaton, or Hassan Guy Eaton. I don't remember which name he wrote this under, but Eaton is Eaton. He definitely has that last name attached to the book. It's called King of the Castle: Choice and Responsibility in the Modern World. It's a very interesting read. I mean, you may find it useful if you take a look at that at some point. So he looks at this whole notion of the absence of responsibility. Because it's a kind of descent from the human to the subhuman, isn't it? Because the human being, because they have a free will, then it's because they have volition. They are responsible for their volitional acts. But the modern world, thrives on the abdication of responsibility, and it even, delays adulthood with this whole thing called adolescence, like that, like it's an actual stage. And there's no sort of, as there are in traditional societies, rituals of transition into adulthood, right? That is something which is completely absent. The notion of being responsible for what you're doing. There's all sorts of methods. I can't be responsible. I have this mental problem. I have attention deficit syndrome. I don't know. There's all these sorts of strange sort of things that have come about where people constantly avoid being responsible. And that's also there in the realm of business, in the realm of industry. A CEO can't be held responsible. A corporation is a person. These are all examples of these bizarre structures and anomalies of the modern world.
Yeah, and that's definitely a nice summary of all of that.
Yeah, that's another reason. I mean, if you notice, I remember when I was a child, it wasn't so much like that. There were sort of avenues, especially for young men, to exercise that sort of part of it, whether it was in the Boy Scouts or whether it was in some sort of physical culture, physical education. A lot of that has gone away now in America. I don't know if there's another interesting film that sort of sheds some light on that. It's called Fight Club. Have you ever seen this movie?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, so since you've seen the movie, I don't have to explain it. I'm sure it's familiar to others as well. I know it's familiar to the people who will be listening to this and who are listening. So I was told recently by a very close friend of mine, he was attending a wedding and got into conversation with the wedding guests. And there was a female present at this wedding party, and they get into this conversation. And it turns out that she studies gender studies and is a feminist. All right, all well and good. So he was just curious because he had read some of these things. He said, so do you read Judith Butler? And she said, oh yeah, Judith Butler is a big, important author on our reading list. And then they got into this discussion of, feminist theory and so on and so forth. And it turns out that this lady told him that in one of her courses, they actually studied the movie Fight Club. And how did they study this? They studied this as an example of toxic masculinity and misogyny. And I was so astonished on one level. On another level, I wasn't astonished. But that's the direction these things are going. So that, if you, have some interest in this kind of, let's say, physical culture, or even, if you read the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, if these are your interests, then you are a fascist in the making. You see. And so this is the way that the so-called culture is moving. And one can only shudder to think that as to what further awaits us on the horizon as we descend further and further to the extreme minimum, and then who knows what will happen after that. But I fear that it isn't far off. At any rate, Nico, I think we're coming up on about almost 2.5 hours.
Yeah, well.
So I don't know if you have any concluding any. Yeah.
Well, I'll just say it's
been
a great
thoughts?
discussion.
I don't think anybody else has. Yeah.
Go ahead. I'll just say it's a great discussion and very informative. I'm really excited to do this again.
Yeah, I really enjoyed myself. I think that there are not a lot of avenues or outlets, whether on social media, what have you, to have these kind of discussions, especially this kind of extended thing. You can't put all this in a tweet now, can you, or on a
Yes.
post? So, that was part of the reason I wanted to do this, that I wanted to provide, for want of a better term, a space, albeit virtual, for, well, at least for some of you, virtual, and if you're around, you can come and physically attend, but to provide a space, just for the examination, also just an exchange. I mean, it's very important, I think it's really important to have like-minded interlocutors. That's the nature of human beings. Human beings, Aristotle said, man is a political animal. I think there's an interesting thing also with the notion in Confucianism, and we'll conclude here, of I'm not really sure, I think it's pronounced Ren, where you have, the character for human being, right? And then you have two. And so there's this notion that, that virtue means human beings living together. It's very easy to be a virtuous person if you're just a monk all by yourself in a telephone booth sized room, right? So on that note, I think that, discussing together, engaging with one another is especially with like-minded individuals and for viewpoints that don't really have much of a platform, I think it's important. And I really enjoyed today's session. I think it went very, very well, and I'm looking forward to the next one.